My wife said it, without blinking, and she didn't look at me once while she said it. He had no meaningful role in building this company. Her voice was flat, almost bored, like she was summarizing something that should have been obvious to everyone in the room. I sourced every property. I managed the accounts, the filings, the investor relationships. He signed paperwork when I needed a second signature. That's the full extent of his involvement. The mediator, older man, gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of face that's seen 1,000 of these sessions, set his pen down on the table. He looked at her attorney. Then he looked at me. "Is that your understanding of your role, sir?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't have an answer. Because I was watching her attorney across the table, and something in his expression had shifted. Small, barely visible, the kind of thing most people wouldn't catch. Like a man who was suddenly less certain about the ground beneath him than he'd been 30 seconds ago. I said, "Not entirely." Her attorney's pen stopped moving. That said, so when I understood, we were somewhere completely different from where they thought we were. I'm 31. I spent the last 7 years building something with my wife that I believed, genuinely believed, was ours. A small real estate LLC operating out of Virginia. Nothing that would make the news. Nothing spectacular from the outside. A portfolio of residential rental properties across the mid-Atlantic. A couple of commercial units we'd picked up when the timing was right. Steady, cash flow, slow, growth. The kind of business that looks modest until you price out what it actually took to build it. My background is civil engineering. I'd been working in the field for nearly a decade. By the time we started the company together, I knew how to read a site, negotiate with contractors, identify structural problems before they became expensive ones, navigate municipal permitting processes that could drag on for the better part of a year. If you didn't know which conversations to have, and in what order, that was my contribution. The operational side. The ground level work. The stuff you don't describe at dinner parties, because it isn't glamorous, but it's the difference between a property that generates income and one that generates legal problems. Nicole handled the financial architecture. That was always the division between us, and it made sense. She had an accounting background, a sharp analytical mind, and an organizational precision that I genuinely didn't have. She managed the books, the tax filings, the banking relationships, the LLC documentation. I trusted her with all of it completely. Not carelessly. I thought, just the way you trust someone you've built something with. The way partners are supposed to trust each other. For most of those 7 years, the arrangement worked. Or I believed it did. 18 months before the mediation session, things started to change. Subtle at first. She restructured the company's operating setup, said it was for tax efficiency. A reason that made surface sense, so I didn't dig into it. She switched banking institutions, said our old bank had become difficult to work with. She updated the filing access on our state accounts, said having both of us on every portal was creating unnecessary delays. She was the one with the accounting background. I deferred to her judgment on things like that. That was our arrangement. What I didn't do was look at any of the actual paperwork. Not then. That was my mistake. Not trusting her, but trusting without keeping track. The first real signal came on a Wednesday morning in March. I'd left my laptop at a job site and borrowed hers to print a permit addendum before heading back out. She was at a property showing. I opened her browser to find the print queue and the email client loaded automatically. She'd left it open on a secondary account. I'd seen her use for business correspondence. I wasn't looking for anything. I was reaching for the cursor to close the window when a preview notification appeared in the corner of the screen. The name in the preview was Heath Moran. I knew the name. He was a business consultant she'd started working with. About 2 years prior. Someone she described as a financial restructuring specialist she'd connected with through a professional network. I'd met him once at what she called a routine lunch. Mid-40s, tailored clothes, the kind of man who speaks with the confidence of someone who is used to being the most prepared person in the room. I hadn't thought much about him after that lunch. He was her contact, not mine. The preview text said, "Revisions look clean. Original superseded once she files the amendment. Timeline still good before the hearing date." I didn't touch the email, didn't open it. I closed the browser window and stood at her desk for a full minute, looking at the wall. Before the hearing date. We hadn't filed for divorce yet. We had been separated for about 2 months. Informally, carefully. The way people separate when they're trying to figure out if it's permanent. No attorneys yet. No formal proceedings. I had been operating on the assumption that whatever came next, we would handle it like adults. Carefully. Without making it worse than it had to be. That email told me that assumption was wrong. I printed what I needed, put her laptop back exactly where I'd found it, and drove to the job site. I spent the rest of the day doing my work. I didn't call her, didn't text anything unusual. I needed time to think before I did anything at all. That night, I started looking. The first thing I needed was our original LLC operating agreement. The document we'd signed 7 years ago at a notary's office downtown. The one that established the company's structure and recorded both of our contributions. I had a copy somewhere in my files. I remembered putting it in a small fireproof safe I kept in the back of my closet. She knew the safe existed. What she didn't know was that I'd also kept a scanned backup on an external drive stored at my parents' house. 2 years before, when we moved apartments, it was an old habit from fieldwork. I always kept redundant copies of anything important. I drove to my parents' house that weekend, retrieved the drive, found the file. The original agreement was clean and specific. We were listed as equal partners. 50% each. Capital contributions from both of us were documented clearly. My financial input included a significant portion of personal savings I'd accumulated before we married, accumulated through years of fieldwork and deliberate saving. The agreement also included language acknowledging my ongoing operational contributions, the site assessments, the contractor oversight, the permitting work, as a form of non-capital contribution with recognized value. All of it. In writing. Notarized. Then I pulled the state records for what had been filed since. It took several days to get access. She had removed me from the direct portal access, so I had to submit a formal document request through the state's business entity registry. When the records came back, I sat with them for a long time before I let myself fully understand what I was reading. She had filed an amendment to the operating agreement. The amended version had replaced my documented capital contributions with a revised accounting that reflected only her direct financial inputs. The language recognizing my operational contributions had been removed entirely. My ownership stake had been reclassified from 50% to what the document described as a limited participation interest. Language that, as I later confirmed, with a brief consultation carries almost no legal weight as an ownership designation. The amendment had been submitted to the state 6 weeks before our separation became formally documented, and the effective date on the amendment was backdated by 14 months. I called a man I'd known since college, a guy named Ray. We'd worked together on a large construction management project years back, before he shifted into forensic accounting. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year. I called him on a Tuesday evening and described the structure without giving names. Just the facts, the timeline, what I'd found. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. How old was the original agreement? When was the amendment filed? Whether the amendment was a certificate of amendment or a complete restatement. When I answered all 3, he was quiet for a moment. If it's a certificate of amendment, rather than a full restatement, he said, the original document doesn't disappear. It stays on record. The amendment adds to or modifies it, but it doesn't erase it. And if the backdating can't be supported by contemporaneous documentation, he stopped. Do you have the original notarized copy? I told him I did. And you have the state's timestamp showing when the amendment was actually filed? I told him I'd requested those records. Send me everything, he said. All of it, and don't touch any accounts. No logins, no changes, nothing that signals you're looking. I asked him what his read was, even early. He said, I think they moved too fast at the end. The next 6 weeks, I kept everything visible in my life, exactly the same. I responded to her messages on schedule. I showed up to the properties when I needed to. When her attorney sent over a proposed mediation framework, I reviewed it and didn't push back on anything. I could tell the lack of resistance confused them. Her attorney sent a follow-up, asking if I'd retained counsel. I told him I planned to handle the initial session myself. He didn't reply for 2 days. At night, I was working with Ray. His report came back in stages, over 3 weeks. The timestamp discrepancy was the clearest piece. The state's filing records showed the exact date the amendment was submitted, and the gap between that date and the claimed effective date was 14 months. The notarization on the amendment itself was a separate issue. The date on the notary's stamp didn't align with the notary's own records, something Ray flagged immediately, and I didn't fully understand until later. But the part that showed me the full picture was something I hadn't gone looking for. Ray found a second LLC, registered in her name alone, formed 11 months before our separation became official. The registered agent was Heath Moran. Quarterly transfers had been running from our joint operating account into this separate entity for over a year. The amounts started small and increased gradually. When Ray ran the numbers against our company's rental income from the properties I'd sourced and managed, the correlation was direct. The transfers tracked within a few weeks of each rent collection cycle. The amended operating agreement wasn't just a document dispute. It was the legal cover for a transfer structure that had already been running. I sat with Ray's full report for several days before I did anything with it. I read it multiple times. I went back through the source documents he'd attached. I made sure I understood every piece before I decided how to use it. What I felt wasn't what I expected. There was anger in there, real anger, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't move quickly. But over it, or maybe underneath it, there was something cleaner, clarity. When you can see the whole shape of something clearly, the emotional noise gets quieter. You stop reacting to each piece individually. And you start thinking about what comes next. What came next was preparation. I organized everything into a single plain folder. I kept it to 4 documents. The original operating agreement with the notarization stamp visible at the bottom of the final page. Ray's forensic summary, written in clean non-technical language, the timestamp. Comparison, showing the actual filing date against the claimed effective date, and a single page, tracing the transfer history from our joint account into the secondary LLC, with the source property identified. 4 documents. I printed them cleanly, put them in order, and left the folder in my bag. The morning of the mediation, I arrived before anyone else. I sat down, put my bag on the chair beside me, and waited. Her attorney arrived next and took his seat across the table without much acknowledgement. Nicole came in behind him. She was dressed carefully, composed the way she always was, before something she'd spent time preparing for. She glanced at me once when she sat down. I nodded. She looked at her attorney. The session opened with the standard setup, introductions, ground rules, a brief overview of the process. Then her attorney presented their position. He was methodical, unhurried, the kind of professional who has done this enough times to make it look effortless. He walked through the company's history, the financial records they'd prepared, the current governing documents. He placed the amended operating agreement in the center of the table. Like the last word in a sentence, his framing was clear and complete. This was the document, this was the structure, this was the company, as it currently existed on paper. Then, Nicole spoke. He had no meaningful role in building this company. I sourced every property. I managed the accounts, the filings, the investor relationships. He signed paperwork when I needed a second signature. The mediator turned to me. I said, not entirely. Her attorney looked up from his notes. Would you like to clarify? In a moment, I said. May I look at the agreement you've submitted? He slid it across the table. I picked it up and read through it. Not because I needed to. I already knew exactly what was in it. I was giving Nicole time to settle back into her confidence, and watching from the edge of my vision as she did exactly that. She sat with her hands folded, relaxed, the same steady composure she'd worn all morning. I set the agreement back on the table. This is the certificate of amendment, filed with the state, I said. Her attorney confirmed that it was the current governing document. I have the original operating agreement, I said. I opened the folder, placed the original on the table. The 7-year-old document, the notarization stamp clear at the bottom, both our signatures on the final page. Her attorney reached across and took it without asking. He read the first 2 pages. Any original agreement would have been superseded by the subsequent amendment, he said. Superseded doesn't mean void, I said. Particularly when the original remains on record and the amendment carries an effective date that precedes its actual filing by 14 months. The room went quiet, in a way that felt different from the silence before. I set Ray's forensic summary on the table, then the timestamp comparison, then the transfer history. The amendment was submitted to the state 6 weeks before we separated, I said. The effective date on the amendment is 14 months earlier than the actual submission date. The state's filing records show the exact timestamp. That comparison is on page 2. I let a beat pass. Ray's report also identifies a pattern of quarterly transfers from our joint operating account into a separately registered LLC that isn't disclosed anywhere in the documents submitted for today's session. That LLC was registered 11 months before our separation. Its registered agent is Heath Moran. Her attorney had stopped writing. He was reading. The room was very still. Nicole said, "What is that?" No one answered her. The mediator picked up the timestamp comparison. He spent a long time with it, longer than a quick read required. When he set it down, he looked at her attorney with an expression that wasn't accusatory, just very direct. "Were you aware of the discrepancy in the effective date?" Her attorney took a breath. "I was not directly involved in the preparation of the amendment itself." "The secondary LLC," the mediator said, still looking at the transfer records. "Is this entity registered to your client?" A pause that lasted about 2 seconds too long. "I would need to verify the registration details before." "The registered agent is listed here," I said, and pointed to the line on the page without touching it. Nicole's attorney picked up the transfer history. He read it, then read it again. The confidence he'd walked in with. Not gone exactly, but changed. Like something structural had shifted inside it, and the surface hadn't caught up yet. The mediator laid everything flat on the table and looked at both sides of the room. "We are not proceeding today," he said. His voice was measured, no drama in it, just final. The documentation presented raises substantive questions about the authenticity and effective date of the governing agreement, and about financial transfers that were not disclosed in the pre-session materials. This matter requires full legal review before any settlement framework can be considered. I'm suspending the session as of now. Nicole's attorney began to say something. The mediator raised one hand, not unkindly. "There's nothing to mediate until these questions are resolved," he said. "I'll be noting the specific discrepancies in my report." I put my 4 documents back in the folder, zipped my bag, thanked the mediator for his time. Nicole was still seated when I stood up. She was looking at the table, not at me, not at her attorney, who was already on his phone, with his back turned, voice low. I was almost at the door when she said my name. I turned around. She looked different from the way she'd looked all morning. Not broken, that's not the right word. More like someone who has been carrying something for a long time, and has just realized the weight of it was for nothing. "You had all of that the whole time," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I had what I needed," I said. She nodded once slowly, her eyes still on the table. "When?" "Early enough." I left. The review moved faster than I'd expected. Ray's report gave investigators a structured place to begin. The backdating issue on the amendment was confirmed within the first 10 days. The notary who had signed the document came forward. Once formal requests went out, she hadn't known about the date alteration at the time of signing. What had appeared to be a document dispute became something with different legal implications entirely. Heath Moran's involvement was traceable through 3 separate records requests. He didn't stay invisible for long once the secondary LLC came under examination. The transfer history Ray had mapped out gave investigators a clear thread to pull, and they pulled it methodically. The properties, the accounts, the equity that had been quietly redirected, all of it was reconstructed against the original operating agreement, which the court confirmed as the governing document once the amendments' authenticity was in question. What had been moved was accounted for. What was mine was confirmed as mine. I didn't ask for anything beyond what was clearly and demonstrably accurate. I didn't need to. It took roughly 4 months from the mediation session to a final resolution. The picture at the end looked nothing like the one they had presented that morning. The last time I saw my wife was at the final conference. She looked tired in a way that wasn't physical. The kind of tired that comes from having organized your life around a plan, and then watching the plan fall apart piece by piece, in front of people you wanted to impress. She didn't speak during the session. Afterward, in the corridor, she was behind me on the way to the elevator. She caught up enough to walk beside me for a few seconds. "You never reacted," she said quietly, "not once, through any of it." I looked at her. "I had the original," I said. The elevator doors opened. I stepped in. She stood in the corridor and watched the doors close. That was the last thing either of us said to each other, and it was enough. Some conversations end not with the right words, but with the only ones that matter. I had what I started with. I had what I'd built, and I had the copy I'd kept when it counted. The original always exists somewhere. You just have to remember where you put it.